Alright, this is important stuff from Unit 1. It's important that you not only write down the notes that are on the screen, but also the notes that are being said. Alright, let's begin with Unit 1. Is the early Homo sapiens. Now, early in human history, most Homo sapiens, most human beings were in Africa. And it's thought that they left Africa and then went out to populate the world, which makes sense because Africa is connected to Asia and Asia is connected to Europe, and that explains how they all got in those lands. But what about the Americas? Or what about Pacific Islands? And it seems that when we had an ice age, the sea level went down, and thus land was exposed that had been previously underwater, which you probably know of the Bering Strait, which was around during the ice age. Now it's a sea, but then it allowed people to leave Asia and go into the Americas. Similarly, in the Pacific Ocean, all those little islands out there, a lot of them became connected. A lot of them, the seas that were in between them became lower and smaller enough that people could travel more easily to them, and the human populations moved. Now, the second point on here is the movement into the Paleolithic Age. The Paleolithic Age means Old Stone Age. And so human beings had grown up, started making tools. Eventually, they start making tools out of stones. Now, these people were still hunters and gatherers, which meant that their communities survived by men going out and hunting and women gathering roots and berries and other wild plants. And this led to more gender equality there than you're going to see for most of human history until we get really until the current era. For most of human history, women are going to be less powerful in the society. But during the Stone Age, they were more powerful or more valued because hunting is such a difficult activity. Even today, hunters with guns and weapons that are much more technologically advanced than a stone spearhead, hunters still miss. It's hard to get animals. And so a society that is living on hunting is not going to be successful. You need to have gatherers. Gatherers will get you through the tough times. And so often survival was dependent on women when the men were unsuccessful hunters. And so they're both valuable. They both provide important things for the society, and thus they were treated as such. Now, I'm warning you now that the next slide has a fertility image. Activity that's known to human beings are these fertility statues. Venus figurines are small sculptures that obviously have exaggerated sexual features. But it wasn't just about reproduction. It wasn't just about sex. It was about the fertility of nature, the fertility of the environment in which they lived. The Neolithic Age means the New Stone Age. And it's new, so that means that something has changed from the Old Stone Age. And these changes are called marker events or milestones. And once one of these new marker events happens, an age changes from one to another. In this case, what we're talking about is agriculture. People start settling down and start planting vegetables and grains. And as they settle down, they form the first cities. And in these first cities, they create more complicated religions. The very first of these cities was Jericho, in the picture here. The last important thing on this slide is that the Neolithic Age is the start of the material that is on the AP World Test. Now, we talked about the other stuff because sometimes they do comparisons between the Neolithic and the Paleolithic. But really, the material that should be on the test has to do with the Neolithic and afterwards. You may have heard of the term BC, as in something that's really old. But your textbook, the College Board, and a lot of historians today use BCE and CE instead of AD and BC. What does that mean? Well, the CE part stands for Common Era. So we have to look at AD before we understand why it's called Common Era now. And AD does not mean after death like everybody thinks. AD means, and here's my bad Latin, Anno Domini, in the year of our Lord. What Lord are they talking about? They're talking about Jesus. And that makes a lot of sense when you're talking about Europe or America even, but the whole world isn't Christian. It doesn't make a lot of sense when you're talking about China to break up time based on Jesus. But on the other hand, this is how we all count. We all count from roughly the birth of Jesus. There is no year zero, and Jesus was roughly born in around year 1. I think it's actually like year 4 or 20 something, but regardless, it's around that time period when Jesus was born, and because Europe took over most of the world, that's the way time is. But it's sort of offensive to people in China. I mean, after all, there was no Chinese guy hanging out with Jesus. They had contact, but they certainly weren't spending time with each other. So that's why we have the CE, Common Era. Now, the important thing about BC versus CE is you count BC backwards. So 8,000 BCE is earlier than 6,500 BCE. Whereas nowadays we're used to counting forwards. 1990 is earlier than the year 2000 in CE. But that's not the way BC works, so it gets a little tricky. Civilization is a milestone that moves us out of the Neolithic Age. What makes a civilization? Not all groups of people are civilizations. They need to have these 9 characteristics really to be civilizations. The first one, cities. That happened in the old Neolithic time. We had some of our first cities. But these other 8 are the ones that really change things. One is a social structure. Now, a social structure means social classes. There is usually a peasant class. In this time period, there usually are slaves. Then there's some sort of warrior class, merchant class, priestly class, depending on the religion. It's usually those are the classes. Now, in India, there's a specific kind of social class, which is called the caste system. Please don't confuse social class with caste. In other words, the India's caste system is a system of social classes, but not all social classes are the caste system. All right, job specialization, there's certain people who do things. Agriculture, which we talked about before, but without it, we couldn't have cities. And without it, we can't have job specialization. And usually there's some sort of complex religion, more complex than just the Venus figurines. Government's another thing that really started with civilization. As societies become bigger, they have to be regulated. Now, if you notice, the big underlined word is writing. One of the big differences between civilization and other groups of people is that they actually write stuff down. They either use symbols or characters or alphabet, and they start writing it down. The other two on this slide are culture. Not that non-civilized people don't have culture, but it is one of the characteristics of a more complicated society. Mostly we're going to talk about architecture. Different societies are going to build different kinds of buildings. But also we're talking about art and poetry. If you hear that noise in the back, those are my cats playing with each other. They'll probably appear throughout these videos. And there's going to be lots of technology that we're going to talk about. A lot of people get confused about this last one, public works. Now, public works are projects, large projects that benefit the public, like canals or even a religious structure or roads. These are all public works. All right, here's where I get a little tricky. Now, if you remember in the beginning, I said you were to write down important things that I said as well as stuff that's on the slide. So this is a little trick for those of you who are just watching it but not listening to it. So this looks like it's a picture from my vacation, but it's not. I've never been to Hawaii. I've never been to the Pacific Islands. But what this is a picture of is a canoe, and it's called an outrigger canoe. So it's outrigger, R-I-G-G-E-R. All right, so it's an outrigger canoe, and people of Polynesia use this during early human times when the sea levels were low. They used these canoes to hop between islands on the Pacific Ocean. This will be on the test tomorrow.